always been innovative with respect to its extracurricular activities.
Especially now, due to all of us being locked down in our homes. DHIS again takes the initiative to bring to the comforts of our home an enterprising and informative session with Mr. Vikramjit Singh Ruprai.
Mr. Vikramjit, like other guest speakers, will yet again enlighten all of us on a topic which is unique and esoteric in nature.
Let's all lend our ears to a talk which has illuminated thousands of listeners all across the globe.
The topic is very interesting as it reflects the ancient era with the environment and relates the medieval people's dexterity in interaction with nature.
Such topics are not just exciting to listen but also traverse to a prehistoric time and make us review our forefathers' activity, which in turn define ours.
Without much ado, we would like to welcome our guest speaker for the day, Mr. Vikramjit Singh Ruprai, who will throw light on how did ancient and medieval India interact with nature.
Mr. Vikramjit is an educationist trying to redefine the education system and encourage the use of lessons learned from history in our daily teaching. He is the author of Delhi Heritage Top 10 series. He has very kindly consented to take 4 sessions with us, commencing on the second session today, the first being on the Heritage India on the Independence Day.
Now I request Mr. Vikramjit Singh Ruprai to please take this platform and address all of us with this inspirational talk.
Thank you, Anushka. Thank you, Neo, and thank you, Billabong, for this opportunity. When we did this session on 15th of August, it was quite interesting, and the interaction that I had with the audience was quite enriching. And I am equally excited that today the topic that we are going to discuss will also be I'm sure it will be new for many and a lot of new things to learn. I'll try to do my best. I'll try to bring in the best information that I can. Allow me to share my presentation. I hope you all can see the screen. I'll just switch on the mode so that I can at least look at the chat. So in case anybody sends me a question or a comment, please feel free. I have got chat open in front of me now on a separate screen. So if you share anything, I'll be able to address your questions. Okay, so what we are going to talk about is, this is basically a series of talks where primarily I am going to talk about nature and environment. And while talking about nature and environment, the focus will be on different aspects of how we have been interacting with nature, how we are interacting or how we are learning from nature, and eventually how we can save our environment, or can we even save our environment or not. So what are the technicalities? What is the easiest way as a child, as a parent? So many things to discuss. And I'm here for that kind of discussion and information. Today's session will focus on how ancient and medieval India interact with nature. Now, when we say ancient and medieval India, what exactly do we mean by it? Before that, I want you all to learn 3 terms. That is prehistoric, historic, and proto-historic. Now, when we say prehistoric, that means the era that was before the written history. So historic period is the period when we have been writing or we have been documenting the events, and we have documented evidence of whatever happened. Prehistory being the era when things have happened and we do find evidence of that, but we do not have a proper recorded evidence. For example, dinosaurs. We have the eggs, we have the bones, the skeletons, the remains, the fossils, but nobody wrote about dinosaurs because, you know, humans were not there back then writing stuff. So we call it prehistoric. Similarly, this, okay, meanwhile, can I request everybody to not annotate? I'll have to, okay, I've disabled annotation for participants as well. So please avoid annotation. Acha. So prehistoric is when something before the recorded history has happened. Historic is that has been recorded, we have got written evidence, proper documentation that we can read. And proto-historic, that's a very interesting term. It's proto-historic is the term we use for those areas, events, tribes where these people have not started documenting their history, but there is some other set of people, other group who are documenting them. So it is the proto-historic phase for the community that is not recording, and it is the historic phase for the community that is recording and talking about them. So that's called proto-historic. A lot that we know about India comes through the proto-historic phase from the early times. For example, if I talk about Bhimbetka, in Bhimbetka, when they started painting and when they started putting up information on the on those open caves, they mentioned about farming, but people living in Bhimbetka were not doing farming. So they actually mentioned about farming that was being done somewhere else, maybe Bhopal or Indore, some that place. And these people mentioned about them. But going to Bhopal, Indore, we have not found any information. So perhaps it was prehistoric phase for the Bhopal, Indore people, but because the Bhimbetka people, which is near Bhopal, they mentioned about them, it becomes the proto-historic phase for those people. Now, there are many technicalities to this definition. I've just tried to give a much simpler version of it so that in today's discussion, we can understand it better. This definition or this classification also means that we have different historic and prehistoric and proto-historic period for different areas. So the historic period of America will not match with the historic period of India or with that of Europe. We all have different periods. In context of India, the ancient India is the prehistoric period to the Mauryan era, which is somewhere around 300 BC. After 300 BC up till 1857 CE, we have the medieval era where we have all these kingdoms. The Muslim rule also start. Down south we have Cholas. All this happens. That's called the medieval India. After 1857, the modern India period starts, and this is the classification done by the British historians. It was easy for us to continue with that era. The earlier the classification was the Hindu, the Mohammedan, and the English period. But then this classification was changed to ancient, medieval, and modern India, which is more appropriate. So this is how we do. And in today's session, we will be talking about ancient and medieval India, which means right from the days of Indus Valley all the way up to the Mughals and these period we are going to talk about. So Agastya is asking if in prehistoric period nothing is documented, then how do we know about it? When I say documentation, I mean written evidence, but we still have fossils. So when we excavate, in case of Indus Valley civilization, whatever we have found by the modes of excavation, we have got found pottery and everything. The written text we are not able to read. So for us, that is still not history. We do not have big books that mention all that text. That is why we call it prehistory, because we cannot understand what they have written. But through our scientific analysis, whatever we have found, some of that I'm going to discuss today also. Talking about the prehistoric and a little bit into the medieval era, this is a slightly detailed classification of the timeline. Roughly 100,000 years ago, which is more than actually a lakh of years ago, Bhimbetka region was inhabited, and about 8000 BC, which is 10,000 years ago, the cave paintings in Bhimbetka started. Much later, we have the pre-Harappan or the Mehergarh 1 phase. From 7000 BC to 2500 BC, we have Mehergarh phase 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, why do we call it phase 1 to 7 is because we have classified this entire area from the archaeological perspective so we can study it. And it is important to study it in this way so that we can tell that before Indus Valley civilization actually started, this much had already happened. Indus Valley civilization is considered from 2600 to 1900 BC. But our history of that particular region where Indus Valley started starts from 7000 BC. So more than 4000, 5000 years ago, people were there and they were living and they had their villages, they had their colonies, societies, they were developing stuff. And by the time they reached this era of 2600 BC, they were fully developed and now they are entitled to be termed as a civilization. Until that, they are just independent colonies who are trying to survive, learning new things. And that's what becomes Indus Valley. And once the Indus Valley civilization is over completely, the next phase, the post-Harappan phase starts and the symmetry age migration starts, that's when the Vedic period also starts. So we can also say that whatever we learned during the Vedic period, which eventually became the basis of the Indian community that we have, came in from the learnings of Indus Valley. Now this whole connection, to establish this connection, it's very important so that we can understand things in a better way and in a different way. By the time the Vedic period is over and it transforms into a different form, Mahabharata period is over, that's when Buddhism and Jainism, somewhere around 600 BC, 700 BC, they also come in. Okay, Agastya is asking, is it possible that before 7000 BC, people were more advanced than us technologically? Well, maybe. We have not found that kind of stuff. What we have found is Stone Age stuff. So if a person like me is in a position to comment, I can only comment on the archaeological findings that we have. During the Indus Valley period, which is 2600 BC to 1900 BC, the kind of stuff that we have found is technologically much advanced. However, they did not have computers. They did not have stuff like mobile phones. They were not able to make paper and pen, which means if this all contributes to technology, they were not aware of this kind of stuff. They had their own kind of technology, and as compared to rest of the world, this particular region was much advanced. That much I can say. Now moving on to the element of nature that we are here to discuss. If I look at the Bhimbetka, over a period of 3,000 to 4,000 years, these people have painted multiple things, and they all have a deep connection with nature. We see references of plants and animals. We see references of hunting, farming. Though hunting is what the people of Bhimbetka did. They were primarily hunters. And the people who were not living in the Bhimbetka region, there are over 100 caves which were inhabited. But people who were not living there far away at distant lands, they were doing farming. And because we saw some references of farming, which we assume to be farming, are there in the paintings of Bhimbetka, this is more of an informed guess that our archaeologists and historians have made, that in Bhimbetka, these people were having some sort of interaction with those people who had started developing the technique of farming. Where exactly farming started, how did it start? The oldest reference that we have is of Kalibangan in Rajasthan, closer to Rajasthan-Haryana border, upper Shekhawati region, where Punjab, Haryana and Rajasthan, they all meet. Near that place, we have Kalibangan. The oldest field, जो खेत हमें सबसे पुराना मिला है, that we have found in that area. But what we also see in the area of Bhimbetka is that they did a detailed study of animals and plants. So the way they painted animals, the way they created tusks, the way they create horn, the way they create their legs and tails and the body, shows that how closely they were observing their environment and the animals. Moving forward, when we enter the Indus Valley era, this is taken to the next level, where not only they are painting, but they are also creating miniature figures. The farming and all has started. We have started water conservation. There are so many other elements that come in. In Ramayana, Agastya is asking, can we compare Meghdut with spaceship? I would not compare it with spaceship. I don't know if it was called Meghdut. I think it was Pushpak Viman, if I'm right. If you want to, if you're talking about Pushpak Viman, I would compare it with a glider instead of a spaceship. It is possible to create a glider 5,000 years ago. I'm not so sure about spaceship. I've never been able to do that kind of research. I don't even understand spaceships today. So how can I comment on 5,000 years ago? Coming back to nature and Indus Valley era, water conservation we find there, because what they've done in every city of Indus Valley, hundreds and hundreds of cities we have already unearthed. In India itself, we have got more than 200 sites. Pakistan has more sites, but they have not been able to excavate all of them. Every single city had a huge tank, and some cities had more tanks. The tanks of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa are quite famous. However, in Dholavira, which is believed to have 12 tanks. We have excavated only 3 so far. One of the tanks is 3 times bigger than what we have found in, what we call the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro. It's 3 times bigger than that. And the way they did their water conservation, the concept of baulis and tanks that we have today started 5,000, 6,000 years ago from this Indus Valley and the Mehergarh and the Harappa belt, which is now in Pakistan. We know that they were worshipping water, sun, and fire, because in some areas we have found altars which are made for fire worship. We have got many references of sun worship, and when later Vedic period starts, the very first Veda that is written, which is Rig Veda, the very first chapter is dedicated to sun. Even later, and when more historians, more researchers and our Vedic rishis, they start working on this knowledge that they had, a lot of importance is given to sun, fire, water, and air. Okay, Smriti, Krishna, they're asking, how do I get this knowledge? Well, I read a lot. I read a lot, and I read different books. I read different narratives. And if you give me one topic, I will not stick to one single book. Before I proceed further, I'll just give you a very quick example. Someone told me about Firoz Shah Tughlaq, that Firoz Shah Tughlaq is considered to be the father of irrigation system of India. And the irrigation system actually started in Indus Valley. So how did the people of Indus Valley interacted with nature, and how was Firoz Shah Tughlaq interacting with nature? If I had to understand this, what I did, I started reading about Tughlaq. Then I picked up the book, which is Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi, which is his biography written by 2 different people, Shams-e-Shiraz Afiq and Ziauddin Barni. Once I read the English translation, by that time I was also well versed with Urdu and Persian. I picked up the original manuscript. This is the original facsimile of Ziauddin Barni's Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi. Got it from Rampur Raza Library, where we have kept the original manuscript in perfect form. And this is a photocopy of that. So then I picked up books like these, studied the language, and I read that. And whenever you want to get deeper into something, it is very important for you to study language. And you know what? Language comes from nature. Whatever I do over next few sessions, including today's session, nature will play the most important, the most crucial role, because I don't know how many of you know, but there used to be a language in India which was called Prakrit. Prakrit Bhasha. Suna hai kisi ne? You can raise your thumbs if you have heard, because I can see your faces also, some of you who have your cameras on, or there is another option in Zoom where you can send reactions. Well, Prakrit language was the old language where on one side we had Sanskrit, which was the language of Brahmins, but the common people were not able to converse in Sanskrit. So they used languages like Pali and Prakrit. Most of the Buddhist literature is in Pali. Most of the Jain literature is in Prakrit. And within Prakrit, we had different branches. We call them, in Hindi, we call them Upbranch. And out of these, all these language families, the groups that came out of Prakrit, now the word Prakrit comes from Prakriti. So Prakritik रूप से अब जो भी बातचीत कर रहे हैं वो प्राकृत भाषा बन गई. So everywhere they had their own language, and collectively we called it Prakrit, but there was a strong possibility that Prakrit of North India was totally different than Prakrit of Central India. Vedang is saying Ashokan script is in Prakrit language, while Ashoka's edict do contain Pali and Prakrit. They've got Brahmi script. Prakrit is the language, Brahmi is the script. These are 2 different things. I can use Roman alphabets to write Hindi. So it's Roman script, Hindi language. Similarly, Brahmi script, which becomes Devanagari. Devanagari is derived out of it. Gurmukhi, Bengali, they come out of that script. Similarly, from Prakrit, we have one of the language families which is called Shurseni. Out of that, we got Gujarati, Hindi, Braj, Punjabi, this region. There is another branch from where we get Avdi. Then there is one which gives birth to Bangla, Odia, Maithili. So they all come out of Prakrit. So somewhere you will find common roots, and it was connected to Sanskrit because both the languages were there at the same time. But all those elements of nature that inspired that language. So, you know, languages are also developed that way. And all this started during the Indus Valley because they started working on it. when I say water, sun and fire worship, you go to Lothal. In Lothal, we do not find evidence of sun worship or fire worship, but there was this one theory that Lothal being a port town, they were worshipping sea goddess. Because even today, area near Lothal, which is in Gujarat, the local communities around that area, they worship sea god. So this must have come from 5,000, 6,000 years ago. Shubhai Singh, Prakrit is a group of vernacular Middle Indo-Aryan languages used in India from around 3rd century BC to the 8th century CE. Exactly what I said. Indus Valley people studied nature at a different level. They built earthquake resistant cities. So we have the oldest recorded earthquake in Kalibangan, which happened somewhere around 2900 BC. So roughly 5,000 years ago. And after that, another earthquake came there in 2700 BC, 200, 300 years later. And then what these people did, people from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, they came to Kalibangan, Rajasthan, and they redesigned that city. So when archaeologists were excavating that city, they found a very well-planned city, which was exactly like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro's planned city. But further excavation showed that there is another city below that, which must have got destroyed. And the kind of cracks that they saw were only possible with an earthquake. So that became the oldest recorded earthquake. Similarly, in case of Lothal, which is a port town, they built a flood-resistant city. How they did that? The river is there and the boats would come via sea into the river and they would sail upstream, come to the city of Lothal, and from there, these people, they branched out a small tributary and made a tank on a different side, and the city was in between tank and the river. So at any point, even if the river floods, the tank had its own mechanism of flood control. And the city and the tank were at such a height in such a way that water level was maintained, but the water will not enter the city. And they had all the mechanism to manage those kind of floods. So that shows us that how they actually managed to study earthquakes, to study flood, basically study different elements of nature. They started worshipping a few. They started preventing themselves from natural calamities. You know, it is the most popular theory about Indus Valley's decline is that it declined due to drought. There was no rain for years and years, and the crops died and the animals died. There was no water. They died. The civilization went into a decline because of that. Other than that, they had managed everything. Even today, we have not been able to overcome the problem of drought in most of the parts of the world. So if there is no rain for a long period, people suffer. Other than that, everything else still, to some extent gets managed. However, since we have started destroying our environment at a much larger scale, the problem is that the floods and cyclones, tornadoes, these kind of things, they are bothering us a lot. However, the people from Indus Valley, they started domesticating various plants. We have got so many references. Rakhi Gadi in Haryana, we have found examples of bhartha. You know, bangan ka bhartha? We have found a 5,000-year-old bhartha. We have found traces of garlic. तो जो सब्जी में छौंक लगाते हैं, तड़का लगाते हैं, उस समय लहसुन का तड़का लगाया जाता था. So what all we had cumin seeds, we had garlic. These kind of traces through the chemical test of whatever remains we have found, the pottery that we have found when they did chemical test inside, these elements they discovered. They found that rice back in those days was not for human consumption. Rice was only fed to animals. They must have found something. So how to consume a plant? Then over a period of time we developed, and that was wild rice. We domesticated rice. Much later we domesticated wheat, and then we started consuming it. So this whole change, the kind of zoomorphic structures that they created, shows how in-depth study they did. All these seals, like most of the seals are containing animals. There are few with other objects and symbols also. Most have animals. So it shows that they were so much into this whole study of nature, including flora and fauna. Okay, Auguste is also asking difference between Prakrit and Sanskrit is just like Hindi and English. Mother speaks Hindi and son speaks English. Development of language. Is it so, sir? Only educated people talked in Sanskrit. Well, Vedas were written in Sanskrit. Sanskrit developed at a different level altogether. And there were a group of people who were dedicatedly working on it. At the same time, the Prakrit was one language which was developing on its own in a very natural way, in a very Prakritic way. So nobody was sitting and developing the grammar for Prakrit. And eventually these language mixed. Well, the Hindi that we have got so many words from Sanskrit, but I'm sure that it also has influence from Prakrit, because we know that out of Shur Seni, Punjabi, Gujarati and modern Hindi, they came out. So at a certain point, they all got mixed and the language was further evolved. Coming back to another element which during this period they found that, now I'm talking about the pre-Vedic era. So initial findings during the pre-Vedic era also included this element. They said that everything is part of nature or existence. Let's call it God, or let me put it this way, that now we call that nature or that existence God. Back in those days, they did not use the word God or something like that, maybe because we do not even have a proper document from that period. But when Vedas were written, at that time, the manifestation of God started appearing in text form, and that is the oldest book. But we know that this information comes from past, because the rituals that are mentioned in the Yajurved, the stuff that is mentioned in Atharvaved, we have found those elements in Lothal, Dhoravira, Kalibangan, Rakhi Gadi, the same altars, the way it is mentioned in Yajurved, how you have to create a Yagya ke liye ek Vedi. The same thing is there already 4,000 years before Rigved, or Yajurved comes much later. So initial findings, whatever they had, evolved to that stage. So they studied nature and they said nature is nothing but we all are part of nature, everything that we have. And that is why in Hinduism we also say, which also goes in Sikhism and Jainism, that every living and non-living object is part of nature, and उनके अंदर भगवान बसता है. पत्थर में भी भगवान है, मेरे पेन में भगवान है, मेरे कप में भगवान है. हम हमेशा से ये बिलीव करते हैं कि हर चीज में भगवान है. So this is from where the idea comes in. They also said that God is nothing but a cosmic energy which is everywhere and in everything. God exists in flora and fauna. वो पशुओं में भी है, पशुओं की उत्पत्ति के जिम्मेदार हैं. Pati also means the one who takes care. Some people said no, Pati might also relate to Vanaspati. So one में जो उत्पत्ति हो रही है उसके, so पशुओं के और वनस्पति के नाथ है वो. Multiple definitions came in, just theories, but main thing is that they said that this supreme power, God, nature, whatever you want to call, your wish, is actually in everything, be it flora, fauna, living, non-living, it is in everything. And there is a body and a soul. So for all living objects, there is a body and a soul. In Sanskrit, body is asti and soul is ka. हम कहते हैं ना कि अस्थियां प्रवाह करने जा रहे हैं. जब किसी की डेथ हो जाती है, उनका अंतिम संस्कार किया जाता है, whatever are the mortal remains, उन्हें अस्थियां कहा जाता है. Now that asti, and when you add a element or a matter, यानी कि तत्व, जब आप अस्थि में ऐड कर देते हो तो अस्तित्व बन जाता है. तो अस्तित्व is one thing, but asti and ka were two entities with which a human or an animal or a living organism is identified. And that is why when they used to wish back in those days, they were not saying may you be well or anything like all is well or get well soon, nothing of that sort. They used to say may your body and your soul be well. Su means good in Sanskrit. So this is the Sanskrit text I'm talking about. Suastika, swastik. So swastik comes in from here, that your body and your soul may that be well. So we get the concept of swastik. They also said that body would perish, but this soul, the cosmic energy, would always remain, from where we get the concept of rebirth. They also said that everything emits a different form of energy. Augusta again asking, can soul die? I have no idea, and I don't think so, because energy can never be destroyed, neither be destroyed nor be created. It can only be transformed from one form to another. And if soul is nothing but a ball of energy, then the same law applies to that also. It's a different form of energy. It's perhaps the cosmic energy, we can call it, but this one law should apply to that also. I'm sorry, I'm drinking in between. I've got sore throat, so this is just helping me to, keep speaking. Now, as this period passes, we move to the Vedic era. In Vedic era, what happened? They started developing figures, but all these figures were related to nature. The oldest figure, human-like figure that we have are of Yaksh and Yakshi, the nature spirits. Shubha is asking, is there life after that? I don't think I'm the right person to answer that, because whatever I say, this is a question that many scientists and many spiritual leaders have been trying to answer, and different communities, different religions have a different interpretation, and they have their own logic for such an interpretation. At this point, I would like to stay neutral on this particular question and come back to my nature spirit discussion. Yaksh or Yakshi? So Yaksh and Yakshis are the paranormal spirits. They dwell in forest. There can be good spirits and there can be evil spirits. They are associated with waters, trees, and everything. They are associated with air. Every element of nature, there is a Yaksh or a Yakshi associated. And if you remember in Mahabharata, Yudhishthir was encountered by a Yaksh from a lake, where that Yaksh of water asked him many questions, and he was answering to get his brothers back. So that Yaksh, so it's not that he's a particular type of Yaksh. Yaksh is just a nature spirit, the kind of energy that we have just discussed. The good spirits are also considered to be demigods, and these are like, they're not completely gods, a step lower, and they are attendants to gods. Jaise Kuber ke jo attendants hain, they are called Yaksh. They are Yaksh and Yakshi, are the attendants of Kuber also. Most of the gods, they have their attendants as Yaksh and Yakshis, which means that our Vedic people and pre-Vedic people were trying to explain us that the nature is nothing but collectively it is the God, or if you consider God to be a much superior entity which encapsulates nature within, still nature is the attendant to God. So if you want to reach God, you have to interact with nature. So nature becomes the most crucial and most important layer between you and your spiritual supreme master, the God. Now, God, these Yaksh and Yakshis are often depicted as gatekeepers, but with trees. And the specific type of Yakshis which are depicted with trees are called Shalbhanjikas. I'll just talk about those. In Hinduism, 36 distinct Yakshinis are mentioned. In Buddhism, there are 69, and in Jainism, there are 25 Yakshinis. The oldest monuments, like I've already mentioned, are of Yaksh and Yakshis. And even today, they are being made. So the oldest structure with human figure comes from the concept of Yaksh and Yakshi. The modern, you come to Reserve Bank of India in Delhi, the head office. Outside, there are these two statues, which are of Yaksh and Yakshi. And in Malafuza Dam in Kerala, recently they made a Yakshi statue. Yaksh and Yakshis are usually depicted without clothes because they are the natural, the way human body is naturally. Shalbhanjikas are always made with plants. You have Shalbhanjikas from Sanchi Stupa to every single structure that they made back in modern era, Kushan era, Gupta era, all these different periods, different kings came. We started calling different periods with different names. Then they all made Yakshis, and most of these Yakshis are actually made on gates of the temples of the Buddhist stupas, be it Jain temples, be it Hindu temples, you'll find them everywhere. Then comes the Kushan school of art. Kushan school of art is a little later. First, I'll come back to your questions. Let's first stick to the topic, because this soul and all is there, yes. And I can understand that people get quite curious when we talk about such topics. But right now we have a larger point to address. So let me finish this. If I have time, I'll try to address it. So when I talk about Kushan school of art, okay, Samriddhi is asking how does Yakshis are made. If you're talking about the statue, Then they were making statues of stone. And if you're talking about actual Yaksh and Yakshi that existed, well, we don't know if they really existed. It is more of a manifestation of the people who were creating these statues. So what happened? They were giving them human form. There is also possibility that they were inspired by the people living in the forest dwellers, the tribal people, and they're still tribal people. So all that was there, and perhaps they got inspired by them and they started making these figurines. But better explanation would be that it is the manifestation or the imagination of the artist, and the artist saw Yaksh and Yakshis as elements of nature and gave them a human form. Now during the Kushan era, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, around this period, in Mathura and in Kandahar in Afghanistan, they started developing statues at a different level altogether. So in Mathura school, we were using different kind of stone. In Gandhar school, whatever local stone they found over there was there. But in Gandhar, which is Afghanistan, Kandahar with a K is how we write that name these days. Over there, what happened? They had a lot of influence from Greece. The Romans and the Greek were there already. So we call it the Greco-Roman Empire. Greco-Roman Empire had overlapped that area. And that's how the Greco-Buddhist art got developed. So the statues of Buddha that were made over there in that area were actually having all those features that you would see in the statues of Rome and Greece. And the interesting part is, before this period, we never made the statue of Buddha. We never made statue of any god rather. We were only making statues of Yaksh, Yakshis, or other human beings, animals. All this we were making. But anything that is given the rank of a god, be it Vishnu or Shiva in Hinduism, be it the Jain gods, be it the Buddhist gods like Buddha, their statues were not made. And that is why during a modern period, during Ashoka's time, Ashoka never made the statue of Buddha. Different stages of Buddha were represented by different animals. His birth is represented by an elephant. His renouncing everything is represented by a horse. His enlightenment is represented by, his birth is represented by by elephant. His childhood is represented by a bull. His renouncing everything is represented by a horse when he left on a horse. And his enlightenment is represented by a lion. And that is why Ashoka in Sarnath made those 4 lions, that Buddha's message goes in all directions post enlightenment. And above that, below that, he has that abacus on which those 4 animals exist: the lion, the horse, the bull, and the elephant, because they all represent the different stages of Buddha's life. So through covering all that, Buddha reached enlightenment, and now that enlightenment goes into all directions, and that is our national emblem. So Mathura and Gandhar school developed, and they, depending on the way they were creating, they created this art. Mahayana Buddhism also came in, and during this entire period, they actually studied nature at a totally different level. They studied human beings. They created figures, because if I talk about a concept of Bodhisattva, Bodhisattva is something where a person who is on the path of becoming a Buddha. And there are 32 qualities of a Bodhisattva, which is mentioned in Buddhism. These 32 qualities include stuff like ears will become longer, skin will become shiny, hands will become longer till your knees. This elbow and knee joint will not have a very sharp edge. It will become smooth. Your armpits will be flat. So there are certain changes in the body that happen, is what is mentioned in Buddhism, the 32 qualities of Bodhisattva. These 32 qualities were very carefully administered and created in the art. At the same time, the kind of floral patterns they were creating, the kind of human figures they were creating, animals they were creating, they paid a lot of time. They invested a lot of time in studying them and creating them. And that is also the period when the Brahmins came to these artists And they said that while you are creating all these Buddhist figures and you have also started creating Jain figures, why don't you create human Hindu gods also? So for the very first time in history, during second or third century, the Hindu gods were actually put into a form of stone structure with a human shape. Before that, Hindu gods were not depicted as a human being, or not just a human being, but with a face and arm. Somebody is asking, do Google know it? Of course, Google knows it. So in Hindu art during Kushan period, the depiction of deities happened. Brahma, Surya, Shiva, Vishnu, they were all depicted, but Brahma and Surya were already depicted in Buddhist sculptures as per the description given in the Vedas. Interestingly, the Vedas do describe fire, they do describe sun, and because the Vedas, they mention them as the supreme element of nature, the title given to them is Dev. So when Veda says Agni Dev, Vayu Dev, Ved does not mean that in a human manifestation fire would come and stand in front of you. It is still fire, but it is given the rank of a Dev, which means it is superior to a human being. So we have Dev, then the normal human beings, and then the Dasas. There are classifications. So these were the Devs, and these Devs during Kushan period were given the human manifestation. You can see one earliest picture of Vishnu from the 3rd century. It comes from Vidisha. A little later, during this era only, from Mathura school, they started developing Shakti and Ganpati and many other deities. At the same time, in Jainism, they were working on different art forms. Kalpvriksh was drawn in many different ways. And in today, on most of the temples, be it Hindu temples or be it Jain temples, you will see Kalpvriksh, which is a tree that can give you anything. And it's quite interesting to see that wherever they made anything, Kalpvriksh, one reference in some or other form, was something that they always did, on all the temples. So that is one thing. Then a little later comes the Islamic era. Okay, I've got a lot of other questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold on to questions for another 5-10 minutes so that we don't skip this part. I've got 4-5 slides more. Let me quickly finish this period, the era that I'm going to talk about. And then if there are any questions relevant to nature and all, I'll definitely take them. If you look at any Islamic building of the Mughal and post-Mughal era, you will find this flower right on the keystone at the center of the arch. Have you guys seen this flower anywhere? Do you notice this? Well, most of the cameras are off, so I don't know if your hands are up or down. I'm assuming that you might have seen, if you have been to any monument, this comes from the Awadhi architecture. So this is from the area of Lucknow, Kanpur only. Tesu ka phool. You know what is Tesu ka phool? Tesu flower is what they started making on these buildings in the center, and it came into the Mughal architecture, and almost every single Mughal building contains this flower. And why to go so into the Mughal era, which is like 15th, 16th century? Even before that, the first Islamic building that was made in Delhi, the Quwwatul Islam Mosque, much before 300, 400 years before the Mughals came here, is by Qutbuddin Aibak, which has that element of Kalpvriksh. So the inspiration from the Jain structures of Kalpvriksh is actually there on the arch. Now we know that several temples were dismantled and the material was used to make this mosque. However, this particular arch is not from any temple. We have our own reason. So the particular photograph that I'm showing you right now is not from a temple piece, but when this mosque was being made, they wrote all the ayats of Quran, and they also made these floral patterns around it. And on other portion, even a little bit over here, you can see wherever they put dot or the nukta, they were creating flowers around it. So that was done. A little later, when the Lodhis come in, during Lodhi period also, these kind of floral patterns were used. So this is the entrance gate to the Qutub Minar, which was made by Emperor Lodhi. It was repaired by him, so he had put these floral patterns over there. And the torans and the malae that you see, all are derived from nature. the elements of nature were used. Before this, when Khilji was building his structures, this is something done by Khilji. You would see different kinds of flowers used. Lota, when you roam around the area or whatever construction Khilji did, this one is from Alai Darwaza in Qutub complex itself. You can see flowers like lotus, tulips, which are not even found in India, but they did that study. You find elements like rose. Look at this one. Above the symbol of, so this is the white part that you see, semicircles in the arcs. They are derived from the idea of sun. Above that, you have a floral kind of image, which is somewhat like sun, somewhat like flower. On the corners, you have some floral patterns, and the red band that goes around that is actually of certain flowers, perhaps rose or maybe blooming lotus. Yes, and I'm talking about the Sultanate period. The entire Sultanate era contains slave dynasty, then the Khiljis, then the Tughlaqs, and then comes the Lodhis, then comes Mughal. So during this period, Mughals used flowers and animals extensively. But even before that, floral patterns of different kinds were used. Animal figurines were not used, but flowers, trees were extensively used on almost every structure that they made. Even the buildings, if I look at the Mughal era, the charbags that Mughal built, these charbags were very special. So a garden would be divided into 4 parts because there is a description. If you read Ayatul Kursi in Quran, it describes the seat of God, and you get into the description of Jannat. You see how many levels of heaven are there. There are different gardens and there are rivers flowing in the heaven. So Babar, when he started the concept of bags in India, started from Lahore and then started building in Delhi, Agra and all. So the idea was that only that there are multiple gardens. There is a garden with multiple water channels. There is a mention of 4 rivers. So they would divide garden by 4 with 4 water channels. And they always had fruit bearing trees. That is a very important thing. So the tree would either be one that could give you good shade or be one that could give you food, that can feed you. It was only when the British came, they could not understand the concept of fruit bearing trees in the garden, because they said that the gardens should be just like the British lawn. So now when you go into a garden, I've seen the garden in your school also. There you have a well manicured lawn. Now, in the British, they came from an area where they get very less sunlight and they get a lot of rain. So for them, an open space is very important because they would always want to sit under sun, and for that they needed open space. So they had this concept of lawns. In India, it was so hot at times that we always needed trees with proper shade. But somehow British were not able to adjust to that one fact. They just cleared everything. All the trees were removed from most of the monuments, and they planted palm trees, which are very thin. So because they were thinking that the view of the monument should not be blocked. For us, the view or the building was not important. The utility of the building was important. For them, it was just a tourist spot. So that is why the trees were removed from places like Humayun's tomb and Taj Mahal, and a well manicured lawn is what you see today. The oldest water harvesting pit in South Asia is in Humayun's tomb in Delhi. And Humayun's tomb at that time was built on the banks of river Yamuna. Now just imagine that you are on the bank of a very fierce river. You got a lot of water and still you are thinking about water harvesting. Because people back then had studied nature properly. They knew that the moment we build a structure, it's not here for a year or 2 years. It's going to stay for thousands of years. And during this period, river will change its course. And if the river changes its course, and there could be a problem of drought, there could be several other problems, water will go away. How will this huge lawn with so many trees will survive? So what they did, despite of Yamuna touching the back wall, the east wall of Humayun's tomb, they created a huge water recharge pit over there. And then after now 500 years have passed, After 500 years, Yamuna has actually changed its course and it is half a kilometer away. And now this area does not get proper water, but this water recharge pit, which is here from last 500 years, is helping that garden to survive. Even today, the plants that are there have not died. So that's the beauty of the place, and that is how important it is to study nature before you get into some sort of development. The water bowlies that they started making in Indus Valley civilization, and even today what they are doing, after the British came in, the concept of bowlies and wells almost vanished. British were not comfortable with the concept of bowlies. So they kind of either they ignored them, they filled them, they started laying pipes and supplied piped water to all the houses, created their own sewage solution. All that happened. But in that entire process, the nature got badly disturbed. We have an example of Delhi where the first pipeline was laid and people were discouraged to use wells and step wells. That's when several diseases, waterborne diseases, started developing. And there is this one theory that one of the doctors, some hakims at that time, told people that, okay, all this has a, whatever bimari we are getting because of water that is coming from piped channels and not through the natural sources like wells and the step wells. This is causing all the problem. But if you can take a certain type of medicine, it will go away. And that medicine, which was desi jadi booty, all local herbs, this medicine needs to be taken regularly, and it was very tasty, very chakpata. So that's how Delhi ki chaat was invented. They started making stalls for Delhi ki chaat, the chaat, where they would mix that masala with potato and with other fried stuff, and you would consume it, and that would help your body stay balanced. And idea was to just push all those herbs inside you. They were medicine, considered as medicine, an alternative to whatever the British were feeding us. So Delhi ki chaat actually developed as a medicine is what the common narrative is. I don't know if there is any other scientific study that has gone into it that has happened that I'm not aware of. There is a possibility. If I talk about ventilation and the cooling system, that is so amazing. I have been to so many monuments in India, be it a temple, be it a mosque, be it a palace. Even if you go to a place like Gwalior, where you have multiple layers of basements. I have been to, I think, 5 or 6 basements. They allow public up till 2 basements or 3 basements. I was lucky to go down because I was doing some research. Even without natural light, even without artificial light, torches and all, there is a way that you can understand how to go through, and you do not find any suffocation or any dampness down there. 6 stories deep, no dampness, no suffocation is a big achievement. Firoz Shah Tughlaq's minister, Junan Shah Telangani, built buildings, huge structures, which at that time were considered impossible. And he was able to ensure that at any point there is no darkness, there is no dampness, there is no suffocation. I've been to huge towers built by many of those old kings. And while walking through those towers, even when you go inside Qutub Minar appears to be a solid sealed structure. But Qutub Minar has got small holes at many sides, which only you can see when you're observing it from a very close proximity or very carefully. It has got slits in between on all sides. So anywhere you are standing, without artificial light, without lamps and torch, during the daytime, Qutub Minar from inside will always be lit up with very mild light, and you can go all the way up till top. And also, they are made at such angles that there will be air circulation in there, no dark areas. So when they were doing all this, they were actually, I teach, I train teachers basically, and sometimes I interact with students also. I was teaching at an architecture college in Delhi, and we were at 3rd floor, and this architecture college had a very long auditorium kind of hall. It was just a hall, simple multi-purpose hall, which from 3 sides was open because it was outside. It was in such a way, on one side of the building, on 3 sides it had windows, and all glass windows. but these windows were sealed, and they had about 12 air conditioners in that room, a huge hall. And I asked these guys that you are on third floor, if you can just keep these windows open. I mean, they are sealed, but you are an architecture college. You could have designed them in such a way that if you keep these windows open and let the air circulate, you don't need 13 air conditioners in this room, 12 or 13 air conditioners. How much electricity you would save, the amount of damage you are doing to the environment just by keeping sealed windows is huge. So, these kind of elements are there, and you need to study nature very carefully before you can implement anything. So my today's session was just to tell you how we started interacting with nature back in those days. I'll come back with more sessions where I'm going to talk about a later period of even during modern era, how we are interacting with nature, how we are implementing things, what kind of damage we are doing, and later we will also talk about what we can do in future. For today, thank you. Thanks for joining me. I'll quickly look at the chat, what all questions I've had. I can see a long list. Specs have to come back. Okay. Saiba is saying, was it Lumbini? When I was searching for the answer, I got a paragraph on Lumbini. The Buddha was born into a noble family of the Kshatriyas in Lumbini in 563 BC. According to Buddhist tradition, he was called Siddhartha Gautam. In his childhood, his father was King Suddhodan, leader of the Shakya clan in what was the growing state of Kosal, and his mother was Queen Maya. Yes, in Lumbini, to Queen Maya, Siddhartha was born, and when he was born, Maya had a dream of an elephant, which signified that she's going to have something very big, and that is why birth of Buddha is always depicted by elephant. When he grew up, his sun sign was Taurus, the bull, and that is why his childhood and his youth is represented by a bull. When he ran away from his house, from his royal family, he renounced his the princehood that he had. He left his royal attire and his everything royal that he had. That horse and the running away is depicted by a horse symbol. And then when he was enlightened, he is depicted by a lion. Significance of using flour, particularly if any, please let us know. Shagun is asking. Well, flour is the most common and the closest thing that you have from nature. Animals are also there, but animals can run away. Flour is always with you. Plants are all around you. So they picked up this one element of nature and they started using it on the building. In Awadhi architecture, you also see human and animal figures. You go to Sultanabad in Lucknow, you go to different Imambadas, you would see, I have seen this one particular thing in Sultanabad, where you have mermaid kind of figure, or figures where you have animal and human fusing, different types of animals combining. You come to the Nawab of Awadh Safdarjung's tomb in Delhi, you have a plant, and out of that plant, a bird is coming out. So the fusion of nature, they were studying these and they were creating these kind of figures. So it is their creativity. Humayun's tomb is in Persian culture. It was built by his wife and was in Persian culture. Persian culture might not be the most appropriate word. We would say the Persian architecture did influence Humayun's tomb, but the culture was still local because a lot of things from the local Indian culture were adopted, including the six-pointed star, certain type of flowers which are local to this area. They were all adapted while creating the structure. But yes, the architecture did come in, but it was not during the Mughal era. That particular type of architecture was already here from last 300 years. And they just used it. By this time, it was refined to a level. Is it true that Taj Mahal under Yamuna River based on bamboo stands? No, not bamboo, but yes, there are wooden planks, because when you have a foundation which is right next to any water body, you would have to create wells, a hollow shaft. That is very important. That's a requirement of building construction. So that has to happen. And in that, they were always using wood, because back in those days, to create a well, a wooden circle was created, a wooden ring was created, and through that they would start excavating, clearing the area and making it proper. So that was there. Like hypothermia, I'm also saying, I don't know hypothermia is in context with which comment that we made. As Yamuna is drying, is it harmful for Taj Mahal? Yes, definitely. Not just for Taj Mahal, but for many such buildings that are constructed right next to any river or any water body, because these buildings were constructed in such a way that water will always keep the foundation moist and keep its strength on. If the water goes away, the foundation will dry up because it is nothing but simple mud and wood. As long as that wood is submerged in water, it will retain its strength. You take the water out, it will dry, entire building will collapse. Famin saying a great session. Thank you. Joshita is also thanking me. Well, I'm glad that you guys enjoyed. Sir, was there natural prosperity in India before the arrival of British? There was, there is, and there will be, as long as we don't interfere. I won't be blaming the British by any means. I would say that because British came and they went away. Yes, they couldn't understand us properly, but then even we did not understand ourselves. So who are we to blame, the British or even the Mughals or even any of the kings who came in? And even if they did, whatever has happened has happened. Now let's save our environment. Is Aryan invasion theory true or false? You need to study the excavation of Rakhi Gadi, where we have found a 4,500-old DNA, which shows that there was nothing like Aryan invasion. But just 2 years back or 1.5 years back, this report was published and still work is happening. So perhaps in few coming years, we will be able to give a better picture to this whole theory. Okay, just a second. My screen share was stopped, so everything just went for a toss. Give me 1 second. I have to settle this back. Okay, I've got a lot of other questions. So what did ancient people say about fire? Well, ancient people, you should check out the chapters in Rig Veda where they studied fire and they started worshipping fire. That came in. Okay, I think I've answered most of the questions. If there is anything critical that I've left, maybe you can type again. The chat all went off. So back to you, Neo and Anushka. Neo and Anushka, you can unmute and you can continue the session.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an interesting and engrossing speech. It had us on the edge of our seats throughout. All of us was very new to us, in fact, a revelation for us. I'm very sure everyone must have been amazed to know how ancient and medieval India interacted with nature. A great learning indeed.
Our heartfelt gratitude to our founder and CEO, Mrs. Preeti Agarwal, for initiating such talks which kindles in us the curiosity and deepens our knowledge.
We also convey our gratitude to our guest speaker, Mr. Vikramjit Singh Ruprai, for his dynamic talk and wonderful correlation with the past.
Thank you so much, everyone, to be a part of this BHIS Council Chronicles.
We will meet again next week on 30th August 2020 at the same time and on a different topic with Mr. Vikramjit. Stay home, stay safe.
Thank you.